Good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's Headline Money Masterclass, Sustainability, Expect More Than Returns, in association with Schroders. Our speakers today are Kate Rogers, Head of Sustainability at Schroders Wealth Management, and Catherine Davidson, Portfolio Manager, Global and International Equities at Schroders. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Helen MacDonald, and I'm going to outline the format for today before handing over to the speakers. The session will last for around an hour in total. First, we'll hear from Kate and Catherine, and then open up the floor to questions from you. I can see there are plenty of you on the call, so just a quick reminder that you've all been automatically muted and your video is turned off. But there is a Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. This Q&A box will be live throughout the session, so do post your questions during the presentations, and we'll answer as many as we can of them at the end. Schroders will follow up on any questions that we don't have time to cover during the session. If you'd like to tweet during the masterclass, our hashtag is HMMasterclass, and our Twitter handle is @headlinemoney_. So let's get started. Before we start the presentation, we're going to take a couple of polls. The active poll will appear on screen for approximately 30 seconds with options for you to vote. The results will be shared on screen after the presentation, just before we start the Q&A. Charlotte, could you show the first question? Lovely, thanks, Charlotte. So I'm delighted to hand over to Kate, who will be doing the first part of the presentation.
Good morning. I hope that woke you up. It's a pleasure to talk to you today. My name is Kate Rogers. I am Head of Sustainability at Schroders Wealth Management. So it's a pivotal moment for sustainability. We've now entered what the UN calls the decade of action, the 2020s, with the pandemic amplifying existing inequalities by race, by gender and wealth, and an escalating urgency to tackle the climate and ecological crises. So it's no coincidence that we're seeing a huge increase in interest in sustainable investing. I think it reflects a broader change in values across society. For example, we're also seeing consumers choosing to spend their money with sustainable brands and people refusing to work for companies that do harm. This change in values is important for us as an investment manager, both because it changes the prospects for the companies in which we invest and because it changes how people want to invest their savings, their pensions. So in this session, what we're going to try and do is break down some of the barriers to sustainable investing. I'll do my best to explain some of the commonly used jargon and help you understand how we think about sustainability at Schroders. And then Catherine will show you how she translates the theory into practice, investing in the equity market. So let's start by defining sustainability. Well, in 1982, the UN defined sustainability as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Or, as Sir David Attenborough put it, if you want to know if something is sustainable, just ask yourself, can we do this over and over again forever? So sustainability doesn't mean standing still. We can still develop, we can still grow, But in order to do so, we need to keep three things in mind at once: social progress, economic development, and climate and the environment, also known as planet, people, and profit. A focus on profit alone at the expense of the planet has led us to climate and ecological crises and has created huge inequality. So we need to try and find the right balance, that sweet spot in the middle. These are the three pillars of sustainable development. All must be considered together. And there's actually a plan for this. As you'll probably have heard of, all the countries in the United Nations agreed on 17 sustainable development goals. These range from things like eradicating poverty to encouraging responsible consumption. These goals are the closest thing the world has to a strategy and provides an important focus for governments, for policymakers, academics, economists, philanthropists, and even investors. In fact, we all have a part to play. So what do we mean by sustainable economy? Well, new economic thinking is challenging these sort of unsustainable growth ambitions, that linear GDP growth that can go on forever. One such economist is Kate Raworth. You may have read her book, Donut Economics. I recommend the TED Talk. She describes a donut economy, an economy that meets the needs of all within the means of the planet. In her donut, growth is enough to provide for humanity, people, that blue ring, exceeding the social foundation, providing water, food, energy, health, education, housing, work, etc., but stays within our planetary boundaries, which is that dark green ring, the ecological ceiling. The donut gives us a safe and just space for humanity and defines the economic goals that should frame policy decisions in her view. So how does this relate to investments? Well, just as economies don't operate as closed systems without having any impact on people or planet, on society or the environment, neither do companies. Companies don't operate in a vacuum. All companies, all investments have an impact on people and the planet. Their operations and products have ripple effects on the economies, societies, and the environment in which they work. We believe we are entering into a new phase for investing. Traditionally, investments would be appraised on two dimensions, risk and return. We believe the future of investing accounts for a third dimension, impact. But more on this evolution later. Let's first consider the evolution of sustainable investing and tackle some of the confusing myriad of options and terms that are used today. So as early as the 17th century, the Quakers were applying their values to their financial decisions. In the early 20th century, there is evidence that both the Methodists and the Quakers were investing in the stock market, excluding companies involved in alcohol, gambling, and armaments. Ethical investment tied to values is what describes this approach. In the 1980s, we saw more investors focused on benefiting people and planet, integrating into decision-making and thinking about responsible and sustainable investment. And then in the 2000s, we found people wanting to contribute to solutions, talking about thematic and impact investment that actively contributes to the Sustainable Development Goals. We believe now the best approaches combine all of these together in whole portfolio impact approach. And we recommend something called the ABC framework, that avoiding harm, benefiting people and planet, and contributing to solutions. What I would say is over this time, we've seen a reduced reliance on exclusions and an increasing integration of ESG risk factors. And as I've said, the next stage is managing and measuring impact. Now, it's clear to us that environmental, social and governance factors matter. And that is why we've seen that huge increase in the amount of funds under management taking into account and integrating ESG criteria. And that's explained by some of these studies. Stronger ESG scores correlate to lower price declines, as you can see on the left-hand side of this chart. This shows an ESG score, and it shows the price declines over 5 years. You can see that the higher ESG score correlates to lower price declines, and the lower ESG scores correlate to higher price declines. On the right-hand side, we can see a contemporary version of this. In the coronavirus crisis, we saw that companies with higher ESG scores saw lower earnings cuts in 2020. That can be shown by the chart. You can see the dark blue is the companies that were below the sector median in terms of their ESG score, and in the lighter green above the sector median. So you can see that environmental, social and governance factors clearly matter to reducing risk. And this is of increasing importance. Mark Carney said, as he said in his Wreath lectures, things that we once considered biblical are happening every year. It's also social consciousness is leading to significant disruption. So we're seeing increasing social expectations, people expecting companies to consider both people and planet in their decision making. That feeds through into regulatory and political pressure, into corporate behaviour, and creates therefore important drivers for investment returns. So just a moment to talk about integrating ESG. ESG stands for environmental, social and governance factors. When we're talking about integrating ESG, what we're saying is that decision-making, investment decision-making, thinks about the environment, society, and the way it's then implemented through governance in the investment decision-making factor, in the investment decision-making process. The integration of ESG factors is usually used to enhance traditional financial analysis, but it remains focused on financial performance. It doesn't tell you if a company has a positive impact, so please do beware of greenwashing, and ESG ratings are not consistent. An example is Tesla, that can be very highly rated by one rating agency, whereas rated very lowly on another agency's evaluation criteria. So ESG integration is critical, but is not enough. We must also measure impact. So back to these three key dimensions of investing. Our Chief Executive, Peter Harrison, said at the beginning of this year, now there is a new dimension to investing. Investors must understand the cost of a company's entire activity. They must value their stocks based on impact-adjusted profits. So what did he mean by this? What he means is that there's now evidence to suggest that the impact of a company influences its future profitability. Let me give you an example. I'm going to compare Nike and Adidas. I'm sure you know what they do. So Nike has $37 billion of sales per annum. But our impact measurement tool suggests we should take off about $1 billion of that to adjust for wages and tax. Compare that to Adidas, which has $29 billion of sales. And instead of a debit, Fair Pay adds a $1.6 billion impact credit. Now, I'm not making any comment about which is a better investment. I'm merely showing you that considering impact is significant and is important as a better way to understand a company. And we can do the same thing for carbon emissions, for waste, or medicine provision. You can see that impact measurement tools enable us to get a much better picture of the businesses in which we want to invest. Profit only tells half the story. And this is where we can benefit from the resource of Schroders with market-leading impact measurement tools that inform our investment decisions. I'm sure Catherine will talk about this in a moment. So SustainX quantifies the harm or the benefit across people and planet, while ThemeX allows us to measure how a company contributes to the Sustainable Development Goals. These tools can help us identify companies that are less exposed to the risks and more exposed to the opportunities of a changing world, and also those that have the ability to transition, where we can use our influence to create change. And our influence is significant. We have over over 500 billion pounds of assets under management globally, and we vote at over 6,000 company meetings each year. We also engage with over 2,000 engagements with companies worldwide last year, and 3/4 of those engagements are logged, or over 3/4 of them are logged as successful. They result in actual change. So we can use our influence as well as the way we invest to promote a more sustainable future. And we use that influence with intention, encouraging the transition to a net zero economy and voting against companies that don't show enough progress on things like boardroom diversity. I'm really proud of the impact that our gender diversity engagement has helped to achieve, with 30 women appointed to all male boards over the last few years. So I hope you can see that sustainability is at the heart of all we do. For all of our investments, we integrate ESG. We use our influence and we measure our impact because we believe it makes good financial sense. For our sustainable portfolios and funds, we go one step further. For those clients that want to meet financial goals and actively deliver a positive impact on people and planet. This is a choice to take action, because what we're trying to do with our sustainable portfolios is design them to have an intention to invest for a better future. In the face of huge challenges like protecting biodiversity, climate change, and inequality. And there's a clear framework to do that. Using my favourite equation, intention plus action equals impact. Just as I can't fulfil my intention to get fit without actually going on a jog, our sustainable portfolios can't deliver a positive impact without taking action in both the way we use our influence and the way we invest. So I said I'd come back to this ABC framework. This comes from the Impact Management Project and is an easy way, I think, to think about how you can invest sustainably. A is avoiding harm. It's clearly a priority that we look to avoid harm with all the investments in our sustainable portfolios. We can't invest for a better future by investing in businesses that put that future at risk. This forms the foundation of the approach. For B, benefiting people and planet, we want the majority of our portfolios to invest in sustainable businesses, balancing those three pillars of profit, people, and planet. And by this, I mean businesses that provide fair employment, support worker rights, create diversity and inclusion, and with products that promote responsible consumption. Then for C, which tends to be a smaller portion of the assets that we can invest, we want to actively contribute to solutions, allocating capital to areas of social and environmental need. That could be social housing, renewable energy, and education. Here, what we're looking to do is directly accelerate action to achieve those sustainable development goals. And importantly, we then need to measure and report the impact of these investments to our clients. So, some concluding remarks before I pass over to Catherine. My 5 key takeaways and a parting thought. Firstly, let's be clear what sustainable investments are trying to do, which is to generate both a positive return for investors and a positive impact for people and planet. Secondly, in order to do this, we need ESG integration, but it's not enough. we also need to measure and manage the real world impact. And in order to do that, we remember my favorite equation, intention plus action equals impact, because intention is nothing without action. And the actions that we can take as investors range from avoiding harm to contributing to solutions. There's a simple way to check for greenwashing. Check that the action measures up to the intention. Look underneath the bonnet for what the investments actually are and how the fund manager is using their influence. And my parting thought, I truly believe that we have an opportunity to build back better from this pandemic and to help businesses take real action in the urgent fight against climate change. We can have a much greater impact working together. So we really want to encourage collective action to drive progress in the things we all care about the most. And you all have a really important role in that. I'll hand over to Catherine.
Mobile phones have proved essential in regions of Africa where it's easier to erect masts than lay cables. But increasingly, the benefits of telecommunications go beyond connecting people through calls and texts. One business in particular, Safaricom, has been credited with pioneering a mobile-based payment system in 2007. Called M-Pesa, it's allowed millions of people to make secure cashless transactions by SMS instantly, even where there aren't banks for thousands of miles, and even if they don't have a bank account.
Safaricom is the largest mobile network operator in Kenya. It has an attractive track record of growth and profitability, and its 3G network covers 94% of the Kenyan population. Africa is such a young market. 75% of the Kenyan population is under 35. So we expect businesses and services based on connectivity to boom. But there is another part of the story, which is the transformative effect that M-Pesa has had on society.
Before M-Pesa, if urban workers wanted to send money to rural family members, they might have put cash in an envelope and entrusted it to the bus driver. M-Pesa has enabled people to start and grow businesses and access life-changing services. It could pay for an ambulance taxi to a rural hospital in an emergency, such as a difficult labour. It allows farmers to buy crop insurance. It opens up the opportunity to save.
In the same way we monitor financial performance, we track the social benefits a business generates. Safaricom commissioned KPMG to quantify its wider societal impact and found that the true value of its business was 10 times its profits and more than 6% of Kenyan GDP. This was driven by direct and indirect job creation, infrastructure and investments.
The UN has said that the expansion of mobile money has lifted 2% of Kenyan households above the poverty line. The effect of mobile banking has been even more significant for women. It's helped 185,000 women move from subsistence farming to better paid work.
We're looking for businesses that are going to succeed in the long term. And we believe that firms like Safaricom with a purpose beyond profit will be more durable, which could mean lower risks for investors. It should also mean that they're better able to deliver value to all their stakeholders, including, but not limited to, their investors.
Thanks very much, Kate. It's
It's quite an intro. I'm never quite sure what to do with my face while the video of me is playing. But that was a very comprehensive and very clear presentation, and I've definitely learned something new. Who knew that the Quakers invented ethical investing? I thought they were just porridge. So now I'm going to try and make things vastly more complicated by translating it into what we actually do in our day jobs as investors. So as mentioned in the introductions, I run a sustainable fund here at Schroders, and some of my comments will be specific to that strategy, but I'll spare you the full fund pitch, and I'll try and keep most of the commentary general. So I wanted to start by defining my terms, which, Kate's already told us a lot about the different flavors of sustainable investing, but I find this is one of the most common sources of confusion and frustration among clients and prospects that I speak to, because everyone's using the same words and everyone's using them to mean something slightly different. So when I talk about sustainability as an investor, I'm thinking primarily about the durability of a company's business model. So as Kate said, the sustainability being the ability to do something again and again. For me, that's the ability of a company to grow and generate a positive return again and again. So it's really sort of asking, what makes a great company stay great over a long-term investment horizon? And for us, that comes down to two key things. It's companies that are run with a long-term view and sort of cognizant of all of these challenges that we'll be facing. And secondly, it's companies that take account of all of their stakeholder groups, not just their shareholders. And if we skip to the next slide, I'll talk through why we don't think that there is a trade-off between stakeholders and wider shareholders over that investment horizon. Next slide, please, Kate. So I feel like Chris Whitty here. Oh yeah, sorry, you have to keep mashing the button because I've inadvertently put in, there we go. Oh, whoop, sorry. Inadvertently put an animation in there, trying to be too advanced. So yeah, when I talk to retail investors, I tend to describe this kind of corporate karma dynamic where obviously, as we've heard, every company has an impact on all of its stakeholder groups, the world around it, but there's also a sort of symbiotic relationship. So in turn, all of those stakeholders will have an impact on the company's future operating environments and its prospects. So we think that by treating stakeholders fairly, companies will actually be able to better serve shareholders and deliver financial returns over the long term. And you can think about this with an example of employees as quite a simple one. So the way a company impacts its employees, fairly obvious. It's stuff like, salary and benefits packages, it's training, it's investments in occupational health and safety, workforce diversity, all that good stuff. And then maybe a little bit more challenging, but thinking about how that impacts on the future prospects of that company. So firstly, there's a big reputational factor in the way a company treats its employees. We've seen, especially during COVID, we've seen so many examples of companies being named and shamed in the press for mistreating employees or failing to protect them, not providing PPE, etc. And equally, we've seen positive examples where companies have really stood out as working with their employees and the community in this difficult time. And we think that has a sort of virtuous cycle in that it encourages more people to go and work at the company in the future, and also customers to shop there or to consume their services. And we can think of plenty of examples in the sort of recent past in the UK, probably that I shouldn't name, but where companies have been in the press for mistreating employees, and that's resulted in boycotts by customers and loss of market share. So over time, this is hugely important because human capital is the ultimate scarce resource in today's economy. And how you treat your employees ultimately impacts your ability to recruit and retain the best talent, which is what future-proofs a company. And all of you know who've worked for any kind of company that turnover is one of the most expensive and painful things that can happen to a company in terms of damaging productivity, etc. So if you can keep turnover low, there's a very clear payback to shareholders. There's also a much lower risk of controversies, things like strikes and industrial action, litigation, maybe, what's happened to Deliveroo or Delivery Hero in the last few weeks and months in the UK. And you're able to foster a diversity of thought that also enables you to best serve your clients. So while you might be able to generate higher short-term profits by cutting salaries to the bare minimum or under investing in your workforce, ultimately that's not what we want as shareholders either. Out of purely capitalist, selfish motives, even if we're not thinking about impact at this stage, it just makes sense to us that this dynamic plays out over time, this kind of corporate karma, as I've called it. So we have good evidence that companies that are run in this way deliver superior operational performance over time. But the really interesting thing for me as an investor is that the market is still very bad at identifying and correctly valuing the companies with this sustainable advantage. So everyone's very short term. Analysts are, I can say this because I've been an analyst, but analysts are lazy. Forecasts very rarely go out beyond about 3 years. And if you're looking at the US, the fixation is next quarter's earnings even. Holding periods have shrunk across the market. So that basically means that everyone's putting so much weight on the near term and not thinking about the long term, which sets us up for a nice position where we can find these companies that are able to beat the fade because of the strength of their stakeholder relationships, their license to operate their businesses, the long-term durability, as we say. And they're able to compound returns over time as the sort of mean reversion that is assumed in the share prices just doesn't play out. And despite the fact that everyone now talks about ESG integration, etc., we still find that investors and analysts are quite poor at knowing what to do with a lot of these kind of squishy, slightly subjective factors and how to incorporate them into their view of companies. Next slide, please. So I wanted to bring this to life with an example, and I'm glad I didn't put Adidas in now because that would have been looked like it had been a plant. But Spirax Sarco is it's a UK mid-cap steam engineering company. So not super sexy, but I like to call it the best company that you've never heard of. And you can see on the right-hand side, the axis has fallen off, but I can tell you that this company has raised their dividend every year for over 50 years, including a 7% hike this year when a lot of other companies were completely cutting. It's delivered returns on capital of over 40%. It's grown consistently high single digit. It's an absolute gem of an investment. But what's the secret sauce? If this is a 50-year story, it's not about one guy or one product. There's something sustainable. There you go. They've done this again and again. So what's behind that? And our analysis suggests that it really does come down to this stakeholder-centric approach to management, and the management team taking a very long-term view that goes beyond just their short-term profit. So their customer proposition is really strong. So steam systems, who knew, but they can be massively valuable. They save a huge amount of CO2 and energy. They can improve productivity within many different kinds of manufacturing plants. Typically, a Spirax product will be quite small budget and will pay back in 12 to 18 months. So it makes sense from that point of view. But the challenging bit is that because no one knows they need one. This is a product that has to be sold rather than bought. And the key bottleneck is skilled labor. So they rely, over a third of their sales come from what they call self-generated sales, where an engineer from the company has gone out to walk the floor at Nestle or Ambev or the NHS and said, this is what you could do with our products. Proactively pitch the projects, and being able to do that effectively and in a way that makes sense to the customer requires an intimacy with the customer and a knowledge of the product. It requires a lot of training and skill. And as you all know, the UK is very bad at producing STEM graduates and sort of trained engineers. So this is a big bottleneck for Spirex's growth. And what have they done? They've taken matters into their own hands by setting up what they call the Spirex Academy, which is basically an in-house university where they have senior salespeople who are maybe moving into retirement write the modules. They have sort of peer-reviewed training and examination processes. You go through the sort of belt system like judo, and they're able to demonstrate that the productivity of a salesman trebles in the first 5 years of being in the Spirex training program. They invest more than all of their competitors combined on training. And often the employees that have been poached by competitors end up coming back because it's such a nice place to work. And occasionally there is a very clear trade-off between this and short-term profit. So in a post-Brexit, for example, when the pound had gone down, this company's an exporter, so it should have been a big beneficiary, but they actively chose to reinvest that windfall in hiring more junior engineers and expanding the academy. Which caused, a short-term dent to profits, and everyone had to lower their expectations. But as you can see playing out on the right-hand side, it has led to a continuation of this compounding return. So this is exactly the kind of example that we're looking for. Next slide. Kate mentioned that we have a growing suite of proprietary tools here at Schroders and that we're not a big fan of using third parties. This may seem like a bit of a mean-spirited slide, but I just wanted to be clear for anyone who's not come across it before, some of the shortcomings with third-party approaches to ESG scoring. So the likes of MSCI, Sustainalytics, the sort of alphabet soup that's out there in this space. So why aren't we big fans of those? Firstly, they're backward looking and they inevitably have to reward disclosure over commitment. So this is kind of coming back to this intention versus action piece. And it's much easier to assess things like, does a company have a policy? Does a company have a strategy? And that's around 2/3 of the inputs into an MSCI score is those kind of binary measures. But when you think about it, it's not, just because a company has a policy doesn't tell you that that policy is enacted and embedded in corporate culture, that it's implemented. There's a very high risk of greenwashing there, especially for, as you can see at the bottom here, larger companies that have more resources to throw at their reporting. They're just more likely to disclose a lot more. And it also favors companies in places like Europe over those, in particular in emerging markets, where there's just not a statutory requirement to disclose a lot. So in the UK, we have to disclose our gender pay gap. So everyone gets like a big tick in their box for, yes, you disclose your gender pay gap. But whether you want to give a company credit for that, if they disclose it, but it's high and it's going in the wrong direction, I'm not sure that you should necessarily be treating that as a favorable outcome. So what we do, as I'll explain in a minute, has to go a lot more into the weeds. It's hard work, which is why there's demand for these kind of systems where you can outsource it. But we think it's really where the value add comes in active management. And on the right-hand side, as Kate also mentioned, there's really low correlation between the different scoring providers. There's a huge amount of inconsistency. And the Tesla example is a great one, because basically if you want to own a stock in your sustainable portfolio, you just have to find the right ratings agency that agrees with you, and you can have it in there. So this compares interestingly to the fact that if you look at an S&P or a Moody's credit rating, they're 99% correlated compared to 30-40% for ESG scores. And this is not because anyone is particularly wrong. It's just because this is so complicated and so subjective, and trying to boil all of that complexity down into a single number or, an A to C grade, we think is just trying to vastly oversimplify the conversation. So if we move on to the next slide, I'll just lay out what we do Oh no, I won't. I'll just show a picture of Einstein. Yeah. So we've tried to make a case for a more qualitative or blended approach. So rather than trying to distill everything into scores and box ticking, not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. And it's maybe a slightly awkward finding for financiers who like to have everything in numbers form. But again, it does reward active managers who really do their homework. If we go to the next slide, hopefully I'll actually talk about what I do. There we go. We can just bash through thank you. So this is just applicable to my fund, the Global Sustainable Growth Fund, not Schroders overall, but I think you can consider it as sort of the extreme end of the ESG integration that is done by all of our desks across Schroders. So my fund uses this approach called the SQ, where it's not a tool, it's not competing with all the other tools, but it's a framework through which we look at companies. And I just wanted to highlight the kind of things that we're thinking about to bring it to life. So it's a qualitative rather than quantitative approach. As I said, we wanted to bring, when we're approaching things as fundamental investors, we don't expect there to be a single right answer. The value add comes from the analysis that you do and the discussion and debate between the analysts and the fund managers on your team. That's where you're adding value. And we wanted to bring the exact same discipline to what we do for sustainable investing. So bringing that real depth of analysis, and that involves wide-ranging research, so all of the stuff that MSCI etc. would look at, but also using unconventional data sources. We're very lucky here that we've got the data insights unit, which can pull in all sorts of fun things like Glassdoor employee reviews are great, social media customer reviews, recall data, lobbying data. So everything that we can get our hands on. We'll sometimes speak directly to stakeholders via expert networks if we've got a particular concern. And we'll almost always engage directly with the company. And this is true across the firm. Firstly, it gets you away from having to reward disclosure, because often there is a lot of information that can be given, but that's not necessarily captured in a shiny CSR report. And secondly, it allows you to avoid those greenwashers, because you can tell so quickly when you get a management team on the phone whether they try and hand you off to, my head of sustainability can talk to you about that, or whether this is something that is really embedded in the company strategy and that the management team can talk about it. That's a really quick way of telling for me. If you ask a question to the CEO about this, is it something that he handles confidently? We have a very high bar for inclusion in this strategy. And the other nice thing about being active with this and having our own tools is that they can be dynamic and they can be forward-looking. And it's a constant iterative process to find those best names. Next slide, please. I'm nearly done, don't worry. Just touching on engagement, which Kate also mentioned, is a hugely important part of our role as active managers. We see sustainable investing not just about the companies we choose to own, but about how we own them. And this is increasingly driven not just by our sustainability team, but by our investors and our money managers, because we're the ones with the knowledge of the companies. And there's this greater understanding both on the investment side and the company side that this has to be a collaborative approach. We think that investment done right can really be win-win for shareholders and wider society, sort of going back to that corporate karma kind of concept. Our work lets us identify areas of relative weakness and engage proactively to drive change. So you'll be aware that Schroders has recently written to all of the companies in the FTSE 350, requesting that they put in place costed and sort of time-bound plans for achieving net zero. So we're doing a lot of engagement on that at the moment. We also have sort of more ad hoc, I mentioned Glassdoor reviews. I do a lot of really interesting engagements with companies where I've been through Glassdoor and I've seen, okay, they've got a new CEO or a new strategy and there's been a deterioration in the Glassdoor score. What is this? This is a sort of jumping off point for an engagement, how the company is handling that and what it can tell you about what's going on inside. Next slide. Over time, we see these engagements driving positive change, as we said. Kate mentioned the SustainX tool, which is ridiculously complicated, and we've only got 15 minutes left. So I'll give a very potted idea of it. But it's basically a tool that allows us to try and consistently, transparently demonstrate to our clients the impact of their investments. We know that it's increasingly important for all of our clients to be investing in a way that is aligned with their personal ethics and have an understanding of how their money is impacting the world. So it's basically, it's a sort of academic tool that is trying to ask the question, if a company was handed a bill or a credit note at the end of the year for all of the unpriced externalities, how much would that eat into their profits? So as Kate said, this is about looking at the impact adjusted profits and that third dimension. And I guess for us as investors, it's particularly powerful because it highlights unpriced areas of risk, where if those externalities were crystallized, there would be a meaningful deterioration in profitability and in the share price. And lastly, we've just shown the SustainX snapshot for my fund, so just a small plug here. And this will be a growing element of our reporting across the Schroders product range, this kind of impact pillar. So you can see on the left-hand side, the overall impact of my fund, 3.5% ahead, positive territory, and 4-point-something% ahead of the benchmark. And we'll be sort of providing reporting showing how this breaks down into people, planet, the biggest drivers and detractors at a company level, etc. So we're really trying to give the message that, as investors, when we're looking at companies, we're looking beyond profit. And when we assess our managers internally, we're looking beyond returns. So I'll stop there and leave 11 minutes for questions.
Great stuff. Thanks very much for that, Catherine. Really interesting presentation from both yourself and Kate as well. Some fantastic insight there. And we've had some really good questions come through. So I'll begin. I think this one could be relevant to both of you. Obviously, let us know what your thoughts are. This has come from Harold Schroders. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Harold, from publication Börsen Kurier in Vienna. He has asked, some companies give no positive ESG impact, but are necessary for our economy, at least in the present. For example, oil companies. How do you look to handle such companies and stocks?
Shall I start, and then if Kate wants to chip in? So it's definitely a tension in this space, and it's sort of tied up with a broader question around how you invest in kind of transitioning companies. I think oil is actually a relatively easy one to pick on because oil is necessary today, but won't be in the future. So what we're demanding from energy companies is credible transition plans to shift towards things like renewables. And they are increasingly realizing that that is necessary for their business as well. Otherwise, they're not going to have a business in 20, 30 years' time. The takeoff of electric cars in the last couple of years, the levelized cost advantage of wind and solar, etc. I think the more tricky area for me is things like mining, because you can't have all those electric cars without also having a lot of cobalt, a lot of nickel, lithium, etc. And that's obviously been a very challenging space for ESG, and trying to capture the sort of positive impact from the end product all the way through the value chain versus the negative impact and potential controversies from their operations. I think all we can do is try to work with companies to ensure that they are causing the least practicable harm when they're carrying out those activities, taking account of local communities, etc., and maintaining their license to operate. Yeah, I think I'll probably stop there. Anything to add, Kate?
I think the thing I'd add is that that complexity is also at a client level as well, because different people have different starting points and different views. And, we work with a lot of purpose-led investors whose starting point is they want to avoid harm, even if it is, something that is required within today's economy. So, many of our purpose-led investors would want to exclude fossil fuel investment, for example. Other investors are absolutely want to do the transition and want to invest in businesses that are transitioning and that we can use our influence to ensure that those businesses are moving towards a more sustainable approach, even if they're not there yet. So I think it's a combination of the client view, what the individual investors or institutions' values are and value set, combined with us and us taking action on their behalf to make sure that the businesses that we're investing in are sustainable over the long term.
Great, thanks very much for your answers there, Kate and Catherine. Excellent stuff. Got another question here. I'm afraid I don't know who this has come from, but the reporter really appreciated the sustainability in practice example you gave, Catherine, for Spirax. He has asked, are there any other similar examples where you would want to point to where you think there are other good examples of sustainability in practice?
Well, I've got a portfolio of about 40 of them, so I'll not try to go through everything here. But I guess there are some other really interesting examples. I'm afraid this is another employees one, but it's just leapt to mind. There's a company called AIA in Hong Kong. It's a life insurer. And again, they've got quite a labour-intensive business model reliant on sales agents to sell life insurance. And they compete against a lot of local Chinese competitors who basically just hire anyone they can get into their agency to try and grow as fast as possible. But that results in quite a lot of mis-selling, not great customer service. Whereas AIA has a really high bar for the employees it hires. So it's over 50% graduate students, and in some of its Chinese operations, it's more like 70 or 80%. So they have to pay more, but they're an employer of choice, and their agent productivity is over 3 times the industry average. It also means the customer service is so much better that actually their customers often end up becoming sales agents for the company, which is a real testament to the quality of it. So again, a trade-off between near-term growth often in this case, because sometimes they can't grow as fast as the demand would dictate because they can't hire fast enough. But again, in favour of the durability of the long-term business. And I'm sure I've got hundreds of other examples, but we won't have any time for other questions, but I'm sure you can get in touch with Andy if you want to discuss further.
Great stuff. Thanks very much for that, Catherine. Really interesting examples there. And that was actually had another very similar question from a journalist called Nina with a similar question. But I think you've covered that off well there, Catherine. We've now got
you've got the SafariCon where you've got a ready-made video there.
Exactly. Shameless plug there, Catherine, but excellent stuff there. We've got a question here from Leslie Cohen, who's a freelance broadcaster. It's just with regards to some of the limitations you pointed out with regards to kind of the third-party scores for ESG. She's asked, do you think retail investors are aware of these limitations?
Do you want to start with that one, Kate?
What's that? No, I don't think they are. I mean, I think people are scrabbling around to try and find simple ways to define good and bad. And there is, as we know, there is a desire to make everything quite black and white in our world and make it as simple as possible. And as Catherine so eloquently described, sadly, assessing the sustainability of a company that may be in a very different sector to another company is inherently complicated. So I think ESG, I'm not saying ESG scores aren't useful. I think what we want to make sure people understand is ESG integration and integrating these funds and this sort of massive increase in interest in ESG integration. It doesn't mean that the impact, or it doesn't mean that the portfolios that they're invested in won't have stuff that has negative impact. And I think that's where the retail investor can get a bit confused. They think they're buying an ESG index. And in fact, I saw something the other day, one of the top 5 ESG rated stocks in the UK is British American Tobacco, which doesn't seem right, does it?
It was also in all of the MSCI indices in the UK.
So I think that the short answer is no, I don't think retail investors know, and that's why we labour it so much in these presentations.
It's tricky, isn't it? Because you can definitely see that there's demand for a kind of for a shortcut, because you don't have the resources as a retail investor to really see what managers are doing, which I think that's where our reporting is trying to bridge that gap a bit by giving this kind of more reporting around impact and being very clear about the different buckets that our funds fall into. So you sort of treat things like third-party scores kind of like the traffic lights that you get on food, you know, they're sort of helpful to steer you in the right direction, but shouldn't be, you know, the basis of all of your decisions.
Yeah, we've just started reporting for all of our wealth management clients the carbon footprint of all portfolios, and also the SustainX score, so the sort of social impact. And actually the response back from, you know, these are retail investors, these are normal people, albeit with a fair amount of wealth behind them, you know, has been really positive. This is all investors, not just those that want to do sustainable. And it's meant that they've been able to connect their investment portfolio with you know, the impact it has on the real world.
And that'll be the other nice thing that, sorry, this is just a conversation between me and Kate now. That'll be the other nice thing that ThemeX can do as well, actually. Will be allow investors to tailor their investment solutions directly to things that they want to include or exclude.
Great stuff. I particularly liked the food traffic light analogy you used there, Catherine. Put things into perspective for me. We've had a question. I'm just conscious of time. It's 10:58, so this might be the time for the last question. We'll see how it goes. This one is from Candice. Hope I pronounced that correctly. She asked, you mentioned assessing energy companies on their energy transition plans to determine how sustainable they are. Would you be able to go into more detail about how else you assess them, please?
That is a tough one, and probably neither Kate nor I are the best place to answer that, to be honest, because my fund doesn't invest in energy companies, being one of those you know, ethical funds. But it's definitely something that our energy team and the energy transition team actually would be a good people to speak to, if Andy can connect you with them. Sure. After the session. But it's definitely something where we are doing a lot of work at the moment, and you're seeing companies like Shell putting out these very, you know, aggressive is the wrong word, but you know what I mean, ambitious transition plans. And it is, the tricky bit is for us trying to figure out the credibility of those, because when you're setting targets such a long way in the future. So I think the focus at the moment is on looking at, you know, what this is actually translating into on the ground. So that kind of intention and action, what changes can they actually point to in their operations, and specifically in their allocation of capital? Because I know some of the oil companies that we've looked at make these grand statements, but then when you look at where they're putting their capex, it's still, you know, well over 50% into conventional fuel rather than into renewables, and you really have to see them sort of putting their money where their mouth is to consider it credible. But yeah, speak to Mark Lacey, I'm sure he'll be much more useful on that.
The one thing I'd add to that, if I may, from a purpose-led investor's point of view, you know, the things that purpose-led clients are asking fossil fuel companies for are measurable short-term targets as well as these long-term intentions. So it's, you know, it's about the path of transition, not just about the end goal. And a lot of and as Catherine said, you know, it's about investment into renewables rather than digging more oil up from the ground. And a lot of the sort of forecasts or the forecasts at the moment to get to net zero rely on the sort of carbon capture technology in the late 2040s, you know, which actually we don't know whether that's going to happen. And in the meantime, we're continuing to produce quite a lot of carbon into the atmosphere. So it's about this transition, making sure the transition plan is robust enough in the short term and doesn't overly rely on long-term technological advances that we're not certain of.
And only one more thought to add to that one that's just come to me. The other thing we look for with those shorter term targets is ideally you'd want to see them connected to management incentives in some way, so that you know that the management team are kind of locked in and financially incentivized to deliver on those. Otherwise, there's kind of this boon to your share price from putting out a nice long-term plan, but no actual penalty for failing to deliver on it.
Fantastic. Many thanks both to you for those really interesting answers there to all the questions posed. I've just spotted that we've crept into we're just at 11:02 now, so I think we're probably pretty good for time. So without further ado, I will pass back to Helen, who will wrap up the session. Thanks very much from my side.
So thank you very much to Kate and Catherine for that fascinating session. There's an awful lot of information. Apologies for not having my video on. There was an awful lot of really fascinating information in that session. And I think what we will do now is just share those poll results, the questions that you've completed at the start. So Charlotte, if you could just share the first poll result. So the question was, do you think asset managers walk the walk in terms of really integrating sustainability into investing? And we've got quite a range of answers there, with the strongest being partly agree at 39%. So I don't know, Kate or Catherine, do you want to comment at all on, was that what you were expecting?
You probably get the range just as much as you get a range of asset managers. I think it depends on the cohort and who immediately springs to mind. I would hope that we would score highly on that rating, but you know, I absolutely recognise that there is a range of practice, and not all of it is best practice at the moment. But we're all developing and we're all learning, and I think the industry as a whole is moving much more towards sustainable investments.
Lovely, thank you. And Charlotte, what about the second question? Wow. So do you think that companies should be required to report on risks related to sustainability and governance concerns more fully and regularly? That's a very clear answer from our attendees, I think. Is that what you expected?
I think that's even more overwhelming than I expected, but it's good to see we're all in the same camp. And I think I can safely say that companies are very well aware of this demand. And one of the most common conversations I have with companies at the moment is, oh my God, we have to report on so many different frameworks now, and you know, which ones are most important. So it's about ensuring that we don't sacrifice quality for the in order to achieve quantity. But I think we're definitely moving in the right direction on transparency.
Okay, fantastic. So obviously we'll be sharing the contact details of the speakers today and the PRs from Schroders, so you'll be able to follow up with further questions with them afterwards. I'd like to thank everybody for attending today, and particularly to thank Kate and Catherine for those really great presentations. So thanks very much and goodbye. I had a quick question about you said that credit ratings are very closely aligned, and I wonder whether you think the ratings for ESG will move in that direction.
It's tempting to say they will, but there's been some chat recently about the EU regulator regulating the credit, the ESG rating agencies, in which case you probably would see a bit more standardization of the way they approach things, and they probably would converge a bit. But I think absent that kind of force, they probably won't, because it's part of their USP if they can have a different view to someone else.
Okay.
And it probably wouldn't be commercially sensible to adopt exactly the same methodology as the others.
There's quite a lot of efforts out there, and there's quite a lot of sort of efforts, you know, investment or collaborative efforts to try and create consistent measurement frameworks to kind of remove this huge dispersion in
I think there's a lot of effort to improve, like on the reporting and disclosure side, like TCFD and SASB and stuff, but then what the MSCI etc. choose to do with that,
Yes.
they'll put vastly different weightings on everything. And like Sustainalytics is universe relative, whereas MSCI is sector relative. So unless that changes, you're never going to get an alignment of scores, for example.
Oh, wow. Okay. And so that does make it, following up Leslie's question, as a retail investor, it's quite hard to assess any of it.
Yeah. And I don't think the EU taxonomy is going to help very much, unfortunately, because it's just kind of letting everyone mark their own homework and not really answering the question. I think it's incumbent on asset managers to try and provide more evidence to help investors make the right decisions. But at the moment, there's not really an easy answer, unfortunately.